Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. And today for our second entry in our Black History Month series, we're going to be talking another classic American intellectual, W.E.B. Du Bois. I was a little bit confused about how you pronounce that. I've heard Du Bois, but I believe Du Bois is correct.
Right, like the actual French pronunciation, I can't even pronunciation. French pronunciation would be Du Bois, but he went by Du Bois.
Yeah.
So it's
I believe that's right.
Notre Dame and Notre Dame.
Yeah, that's right. Merca. Yeah, and so yeah, a bit of biography at first. So he was raised in Massachusetts, went to Oxford and Harvard for his education. He was the first black PhD in the history of Harvard. Helped found the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I'm correct. Basically just a sort of writer, historian, polymath, multi-talented genius type of person. Worked, he was born in the 1860s, I believe. And he died in 1963.
Yeah, long life.
Yeah, he lived a long time. And, was basically working against Jim Crow and racism. Big Pan-Africa guy for his whole career. And he became more and more sort of socialist as the time went on. And he died in Ghana, if I'm not mistaken, after having sort of converted to a kind of Afro-communism-ish type of ideology. But yeah, he was, I think, best known for two books, The Souls of Black Folk and Black Reconstruction in America. The first of which is a essay collection, which is, just about basically the black experience in the United States in the early 20th century. And the second one is certainly his best book and his most well-respected one is just a history book about the experience of the Civil War and the post-Civil War period in Reconstruction. And one of America's most significant intellectuals, I think there's a danger in thinking about Black History Month to be like, sort of being a little condescending
or something. Yeah.
It's not like I think I guess the entire idea is a little bit condescending, but I think considered in its best light, Black History Month is about reminding all Americans about some of the, the very, very most important people who have lived in this country. And he was one of the big ones.
Right. Yeah. It's not something that should be sought just 1 month per year. The recognition of African American and people of great intellect and artistry should always be sought and nourish our souls as often as possible. But to the extent that people often overlook and forget, if not reminded consciously by such things, it's helpful to remember.
Yeah. Maybe we could just talk about the Souls of Black Folk and some of his essays.
Sure.
I think for me, this I reread Souls of Black Folk fairly recently. I've read a bunch of his other essays, but not for a while. But I think what it jumps out to me and why it continues to be relevant is that it gives you a picture not just of how kind of aridly, the black-white wealth gap is large, that's certainly not good. but what it was like living in a racial caste system, and how like the millions of everyday indignities and the petty tyrannies and the not at all petty tyrannies,
not so petty, right?
That it was like living in, you know, the late 19th century, early 20th century under Jim Crow, under an apartheid terrorist sort of, you know, government. And I think it speaks to, you know, even today you'll hear people be like, well, you know, black people should actually thank whites because, you know, at least you're not in Africa. Because, you know, black people in the United States maybe have longer life expectancies than they do in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Though that, you know, by some of the standards of some fairly poor countries, black Americans tend to have very bad, like comparable to, you know, places like Mongolia or Vietnam or something like that. But, you know, it completely overlooks the you know, what it can be like to live in like fear of the police, for example, to view the police as a sort of occupying force, you know, as people that are very rightfully hated and feared. And so the book, you know, it's not, you know, it's in a sense kind of pitched at sympathetic white people who maybe don't understand exactly. I mean, not only that, but you know, he pitches it to a gentle reader, I believe. And I think one of the people that he has in mind for that is a sort of well-intentioned white person who maybe just doesn't quite get it, doesn't understand what it's really like.
And that won't understand it because, you know, Du Bois is also a sociologist and has many angles from which he can edify and illuminate history and culture. But that is not enough, I think, to pierce the privilege and blindness of those who don't understand phenomenologically what it's like. So it's I think, memoir-esque in the sense that it helps one access that interiority. So it's like a spiritually wise and profoundly moving series of essays that I think can do something for that, you know, sympathetic white person who doesn't get it, if you will, in ways that like the sociological and historical writings maybe don't as much.
Yeah. And it's, of course, you know, I think it's meant as a celebration of black culture as well. You know,
absolutely right.
It's not a
right.
It's not only that, of course. It's not just a sort of.
It's many things at once. It's also fantastic. It's not a fantastic insight, but fantastically predictive. So you know, one of the essays opens with the line that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And this was he wrote this at the very beginning of the 20th century,
yep.
Right? So it is prescient and definitely is bound up with what would become the most important issues of the day.
But yeah, exactly. I mean, really, and this goes to show you, you know, both the depth of his insight and you know, just what a sort of polymath he was, because like he didn't just, you know, write these very lyrical essays and sort of, you know, capture the poignancy of what it's like living in an apartheid terror state. He also had like the political sense to realize that this, you know, this is not going away. And the longer it goes on, you know, the more important it's going to be. These problems are just going to fester. And he, you know, it was very accurate, you know, and it's, you know, in a sense, the way that it reminds me of Mandela in the 1970s, you know, and 1960s, when apartheid in South Africa appeared just almost impregnable. You know, it's like we could never solve this. Like, we're just going to be stuck like this forever. It was like, well, give it time. You know, it's the situation is more precarious than it seems.
Right. Yeah. He also people might have heard the phrase double consciousness. This is something he introduces in The Soul of Black Folk, where he talks about the difficulty of, he might even put it as the impossibility of Black Americans having what he calls true self-consciousness, because they're only allowed to see themselves through the revelation of the other world. He says it's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, for me, James Baldwin echoed that sentiment when we talked about his debate with Buckley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the way in which, particularly under Jim Crow, but probably still today, Black Americans have been forced to be citizens of a country which doesn't accept you, and you're just pinned down, and surrounded on every side with the sort of bullshit hagiography of, the land of the home, free of the brave, or whatever.
Something like that, yeah.
Blue Lives Matter, all that kind of.
Well, yeah. This also, to me, evokes the kind of contempt that Frederick Douglass had for being asked to give the talk on the 4th of July, and that, I think, is all about double consciousness as well. The idea that Frederick Douglass was supposed to see himself as this liberated American. Are you kidding me? Right?
Yeah.
So it's I think it's really, really revelatory and beautiful, this work. So I don't know what if you want to talk more about the souls of Black folk before we shift to Black Reconstruction in America, but it's certainly something we could talk about for quite a while.
He does in here he talks about Booker T. Washington, and this is a big divide in the Black community, the early 20th century. You had your sort of like accommodationist line, because even under Jim Crow, there was a sort of educated Black middle class of preachers and teachers and a few lawyers here and there, people who did have a little bit of means, and, folks like that tended to be, not for entirely unjustified, it was a fairly, reasonable conclusion you might make to just say that, like, look, these white people, they just got all the power and all the money and all the influence, got an absolute death grip on the levers of power. And so, we should just sort of like let them run things, and in return, maybe they won't murder us too often, more or less. That's right. And one of his, Du Bois's, going back and forth with that sort of tendency and I think one of the big argument here that is that, that I think, Booker T. Washington and folks like him didn't really face up to how bad it really was. That was one of the big things Du Bois did with his journalism, among many others, was to write about lynchings and how just, the daily carnage of the apartheid system under Jim Crow, that it was, the terror of it, that every day you're living just in fear, and you could never actually get to it. I mean, I believe this is the sort of the argument here, that you could never actually get to a spot in which you are sort of like living comfortably as a subservient caste. What you are actually doing is living in just like daily terror that maybe today is going to be me, especially if you're a man. If you're a Black man in the South, it's like you just look at somebody the wrong way, or you don't do anything and you just get like butchered and just like tortured to death in front of, hundreds of or thousands of picnicking white people who are like, take your body parts as souvenirs, just the most absolutely psychotic, murderous violence you could imagine. And that was the actual engine of the political and the social system of Jim Crow. And I think what Du Bois really hammered home again and again was that living in a fear of just horrifying violence, and the ways that people had to, just debase themselves in fear.
Yeah, and he writes in his conclusion about Booker T. Washington and his flawed approach in trying to advance the rights and well-being of Black Americans. He writes that Booker T. Washington's doctrine has tended to make the whites, North and South, shift the burden of the Negro problem to the Negro's shoulders and stand aside as critical and rather pessimistic spectators, when in fact the burden belongs to the nation, and the hands of none of us are clean if we bend not our energies to righting these great wrongs. And then he goes on to say, but so far as Mr. Washington apologizes for injustice North or South, does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes the higher training and ambition of our brighter minds, so far as he, the South, or the nation does this, we must unceasingly and firmly oppose them. By every civilized and peaceful method, we must strive for the rights which the world accords to men, clinging unwaveringly to those great words which the sons of the fathers would fain forget. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah. We were talking about that with Frederick Douglass previously, that's really been, so from Lincoln through, from Frederick Douglass through Lincoln, through Du Bois, through Martin Luther King, that's been such a great piece of, like, basically propaganda, more or less, to just like, or just a great argument, piece of political rhetoric. It's like, look at, here's your national slogan. Like, what the fuck, man?
Yeah. No, and that's the thing that's interesting to me is you do see, of course, in Malcolm X and up through any number of, like, even liberation theologians like Jeremiah Wright, a certain goddamn America, forget the whole place kind of approach. But that's not the approach that, like, Frederick Douglass and Du Bois and Martin Luther King took, which is to say that, like, the sins are terrible and they are there, but let's appropriate those ideals upon which the country was founded and actually push to have that realized as much as possible.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's always the danger, if you're talking about American hypocrisy, be like, here's your stated ideals and you're not living up to them. Because you could go two ways. You could be like, okay, we're doing this injustice, we're going to stop doing the injustice. Or you could be like, we're going to ditch the slogan. We're just going to become openly like a horrible fascist country.
Which is what, like, certain segments want to do. And actually to turn that kind of egalitarian ideal into a friend-enemy distinction that's quite explicit now. And I mean, you see this in the fan base for Trump, right? It's quite clear. No. We think certain groups don't deserve to even be here. We think our rights matter more. And that is even more dangerous, folks.
Yeah, I mean, which way you go probably doesn't depend on who's quoting the Declaration of Independence, but still, like, it's worth keeping in mind, I guess.
Yeah, but I think that is indicative of a broader theoretical underpinning for certain strains of activism. It's like there's struggle. If there's any progress, there's struggle. But that struggle is motivated by and cognized in different ways. So, and it's fine, I think, to have, right? I think you have your Malcolm X and Black Panthers alongside Martin Luther King, and together they work really well. But I think that, right? But I think if you have just exclusively the one that is, just to put it a better way, shit canning the entire possibility of change in this country, then
it's
that's
much easier to dismiss in that case, But I think, as you're saying, the two of them together make for a powerful combination. And probably worth emphasizing, like, this conversation between Du Bois and the Booker T. Washington like sort of framework is very much a live issue. And I mean, I think it always has been. There really is a sort of organic strain of black conservatism. And people may not remember this, but before he was, just like this horrifying sexual predator, Bill Cosby was very much a Booker T. Washington type of guy in terms of his politics, and he go around the country, doing these pull your pants up black people speeches, saying that like, we got to take responsibility. And it's very American, in a sense. But I think it's wrong. It's not the fault of, insofar as black people have different outcomes from white people in America. There's nothing to do with black people having poor clothing choices.
I've taught a number of students who I understood. So I was surprised to discover the reactionary ideology of certain young students of color or working adults that were men of color. But then I got to see that it wasn't so much a normative ideal as kind of a descriptive reality. And they realized that the system had failed their neighborhoods and them, and if they didn't pull themselves up from their bootstraps, they would not survive. Yeah. But so what happened is that knowing that was true, and if there's teenage pregnancy, then your life is over. Like if these things happen descriptively, that will lead to X, Y, and Z. Therefore, you have to have these types of Bill Cosby modes of thinking about things because there's no other option. And so I tried to kind of conceptually separate the descriptive from the normative and say, isn't it unfair and unjust that, say, a privileged Wall Street trust fund kid can have a golden parachute after helping tank the global economy? Isn't it unfair that not just mistake but malice can go not only without punishment, but then the person can live high off the hog for the rest of his life?
Yeah, it'd be profitable to do that.
They
will pay you money.
And one teeny mistake or even just bad luck can lead to your life being over. Isn't that something that as a country we should not permit? And then that started to create a move away from that reactionary ideology, right?
Yeah. And I guess there's a conceptual distinction there that you could draw to say that, it may be the case that under current circumstances, you maybe have a little bit better chance of making it if you do X, Y, and Z, versus like, here's why the broad problems exist. It's like sort of like a personal advice thing versus like why is society like this?
Well, and I can see why it maybe is a luxury to be able to sit, from as a podcaster or academic and just think theoretically about things when, your life is very literally in your own hands to some degree, and you don't have the time or space to kind of strive for a different reality than the one you're facing. I get that. But interestingly, it seems like what Corey Robin's new book on Clarence Thomas is going to argue about Clarence Thomas's politics, which is to say that he's conservative not in the way that Booker T. Washington was, but he was a black nationalist who didn't and maybe doesn't trust whites and white supremacy at all. And therefore, like, liberal people in government are never going to help the black human being. Therefore, the only way forward is to pull yourself up by your bootstraps because those racist whites will never do anything for you.
Yeah, that's like the sort of funhouse mirror image of the like the government. The government is the white man, and so that's why we need libertarian economic policy.
Right. It's totally insane. But meanwhile, he was straight up reactionary and is in like the misogynist sense of patriarchy, it seems.
Yeah. Which is, that's another thing that definitely exists in the black tradition and black nationalists, especially Nation of Islam, very, very misogynist.
Well, and a lot of African-American churches, many of them are great on social justice issues and progressive in many ways, but often very conservative when it comes to like LGBTQ issues or other things that are still quite reactionary in their theology.
Yeah. Yeah, it was one thing, one area where you could say Barack Obama made a very, very significant public change in public opinion when he, I believe it's 2012, came out for gay marriage, and that really moved the needle by like 5 or 10 percentage points, because it's like basically sort of creating permission, and like just a lot of African Americans just was like that sort of like the straw that push the camels over to the other side of the fence.
That's exactly how it goes, Ryan. That's the aphorism. Yes.
I'm Captain Malaprop here.
Push the camel through the eye of the needle and made it to heaven.
Yeah,
and,
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Then it broke its back.
But
wasn't Biden the one that ruined the political moment that Obama was going to have about that? Didn't Biden like leak the shift in policy on
from
gay
what
marriage?
I heard that he I'm not sure if this has been settled one way or the other, but they think they might have sent Biden out to do a sort of trial balloon by saying that like we're in favor of gay marriage now, whoops, maybe not, and see if there's a big backlash, and if there wasn't, then Obama
or if Biden personally said that about his views and he got flack, then you could imagine how it would play.
Yeah, you could then you could just say it's just Biden being Biden.
Fair point. Yeah.
Speaking of Obama, this was back in 2014, a big debate between Obama and Jonathan Chait on one hand and Ta-Nehisi Coates on the other hand, which is once again the same argument. It's worth going back. It's too bad Coates doesn't write anything anymore except comic books. But he just kicked the shit out of Jonathan Chait on this exact question, which is like, do black people need fundamental, social and economic reform, or do they need to pull their pants up? And I think that Coates is completely convincing on that point. Before we go, there's a great book that I'd like to recommend that we were talking about this previously, but Lester Spence, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins, he wrote a book called Knocking the Hustle, a great book, and it's basically about how like neoliberalism has infected black culture, black politics and black culture, so including like you have, we're here in Philly right now, Michael Nutter,
That's right, the former mayor.
Yeah, former mayor, black guy, did tons of neoliberal mass incarceration stuff
As a Democrat.
as a Democrat. And then you find just like the hustle culture of hip hop. That like what you need to do is get out there and get that money. You gotta get paid. You gotta, instead of doing like some of those like social justice elements of maybe Run DMC or Tupac. It's more about just like getting paid. Getting conspicuous consumption and having a expensive car and lots of money and drugs and Hennessy or whatever. So still to this day, very much a live debate. Shall we move on to Black Reconstruction?
Let's do it. Very different type of work than the Souls of Black Folk.
Yeah, this is one of the like top 2 or 3 most impressive works of history ever written in the United States, I would say. Maybe number 1. It's not the best history book because it has some flaws and it drags a little in the middle parts, because it's trying to do so many different things at once. But this was written in 1935 at the absolute pinnacle of the Dunning School interpretation of Reconstruction, which is this basically what I would like echoes of this are still present in like practically every school in the country, unless you go to a really cutting edge woke school. Dunning School's got a little bit of a purchase on this.
It's
and
like Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, the sort of like Lost Cause, like the whole school of thought that was like Civil War wasn't about slavery. that Reconstruction, the post-Civil War period, was this like horrible, corrupt mess that like the minute black people got any sort of political power, they were horribly corrupt.
It's all about vengeance.
Yeah, and they were lording it over the poor, helpless ex-Confederates, and eventually it was overthrown, and that was like a shining triumph. And now, you know, it's like the much better, you know, we have home rule again in the South, and you know, this was the thinking of Dunning was at Columbia, I want to say.
That's right.
But it was also, you know, Woodrow Wilson at Princeton,
who showed, I think, Birth of a Nation as a White House screening.
Yep. The idea that you know, granting black people the vote was just a terrible mistake, and that it was much better. You know, he had sort of a national reconciliation, papered over the wounds of the Civil War by agreeing to basically not enforce the 15th Amendment. And so, yeah, he was writing this book. He's writing it at a time of just like absolutely endemic racism in every aspect of society. You know, so he managed to get his doctorate out of Harvard, but he's like, you know, one of the like 10 smartest, most able people in the entire country. And he can't get anything published. You know, I think we read this, a bit of a Foner article about this. He said that
Eric Foner, the historian. Right?
Yeah, he wrote so Du Bois wrote an article in the American Historical Review, right? And it was sort of like in defense of Reconstruction. I think he wrote that in 1910, I want to say. And it was like the last thing a black person wrote in the American Historical Review, which is like the marquee journal of American his historical profession until like 1985 or something like that. Decades and decades of a racist conspiracy. And so you know, not publishing black people, not listening to black people, and in some cases literally destroying the records of Reconstruction, like the actual archives, you know, the sort of government, the business of government that was done at the time. Nobody's asking black people, who many of whom who lived through construction are still alive at this time. And so, like, he is writing in the teeth of this gale force current of racism to say that, like, the entire narrative of Reconstruction that is the dominant consensus in American society is bullshit. And, you know, it's...
And why does that matter? Let's and you can proceed if you want by going through his argument, but I think it's important to talk about why the different and correct understanding of the Reconstruction era matters normatively for us. Like, why is it important to get it right?
Yeah, well, it was just, you know, it was more or less the first instance of the civil rights movement that everyone agrees for now, you know, that like Martin Luther King, national hero because he got votes for black people in the South. Well, the only reason he needed to do that was because like there was just like systemic violation of the Constitution from 1877 up through 1965 in the South, where if you were black, more or less you couldn't vote at all. And so, you know, what Reconstruction really was an attempt to build a multiracial democracy in the United States, which hadn't existed before, and it actually worked for a while. And it was an example of a time in which, you know, the values of democracy, liberal democracy, and freedom and equality really mattered and were really taken seriously for a hot minute, basically, in the United States, and then they were forgotten again. But so there was this shining example of true heroism, and some of the best people who have ever lived in this country, really doing, you know, really heroic stuff. innumerable, something like 200,000 black Union Army veterans were down there in the South trying to, build a decent place to live.
Well, and that's the other thing that's important normatively in terms of not just Reconstruction, but going back to even the Civil War itself, and through Reconstruction, and then carrying it forward to today, is the agency of Black Americans to actuate and actualize their own liberation is something that history, I mean, if history ever acknowledges the agency of Black people, it's in the form of like one leader, like Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
It's like this one dude did everything. He was a special case, rather than understanding that, say, Rosa Parks was an activist, part of a group of people that were in this struggle together collectively. And this tremendous move towards making that egalitarian vision a reality was something born of that struggle that the oppressed themselves were at the forefront of, and that others followed them, right? And that includes going back to the Civil War.
Yeah, and he calls it Black Reconstruction, and it's sort of like maybe a deliberate slight exaggeration, because it's not just Black Reconstruction; it's Reconstruction for the whole country. But what he argues, and I think mostly successfully, is that Black people were the major protagonists of A, the Civil War, and B, the Reconstruction period. The North almost certainly couldn't have won the Civil War without Black people, and Black people were the sort of primary participants in the Reconstruction drama. Which the attempt to build a multiracial democracy in the South. And he talks about, I think, historians dispute whether like this is a correct characterization, but he talks about during the Civil War there was just sort of a general strike of sorts, in the sense that like as much as they could, slaves during the Civil War, they would slow down, not work as hard, try to like gum up the wheels of commerce, and then the second they could, run away, run to the Union lines, and try to get to freedom. And that was at first a huge like pain in the neck for the Union policy wise, like what do we do with all these people? And then later it turned out to be absolutely critical. 200,000 soldiers and probably 300,000 laborers and, otherwise sort of war supporting folks who worked, for the Union Army. And, as Du Bois says, more Black people than, as a proportion of the population, more Black men served in the as soldiers than white people did. And it was through that heroic effort that the tide was turned. Because this is something it's easy to forget about the Civil War. Civil wars almost never start out with dividing the country in half and having a government in one side that has like broad legitimacy. Like conquering a whole country is difficult, and that's what the Union had to do. And especially at that time when defensive tactics were much more effective than offensive tactics, like it took a lot of casualties to finally beat the Confederates. And arguably, if Robert E. Lee hadn't been too aggressive in the early war, they would have been able to just like batten down the hatches, and eventually the Union would have given up. But the fact that the key labor force, Du Bois makes this point, that the key labor force that allowed the South to send proportionally more of its white men out to fight also gave them a critical weakness, because the minute the Union soldiers got close, all the slaves would run away, and that fucked them up bad. And
we should say the enslaved people,
Yeah, exactly.
But that the other interesting thing is the missed opportunity of Reconstruction, or one of the many interesting things. And so, Foner is summarizing Du Bois at one point and says that the key issue of Reconstruction was the new status of black labor. Would it be genuinely free? And the answer to that question, Du Bois insists, could be worked out only in conjunction with white labor. So in the end, the tragedy of Reconstruction was that white laborers in the North and South failed to see that their interests were intimately tied up with the condition of the emancipated slaves. Reconstruction represented a lost opportunity, a moment when black and white labor could have united to seek common goals, but failed to do so. A union of democratic forces never took place.
Yep. Yeah, and that I think that lesson is highly, highly relevant for today. That it was back then, and it is now very much a you'll hang together or you'll hang separately type of situation. Because if you're the organizers, and there were people saying this at the time, black and white, that like if all the laborers don't come together in some kind of like mass union, mass or organization of some sort, you're never going to have a decently egalitarian democracy, because all the power is going to end up in the hands of capitalists. You're going to have like your sort of democratic character cored out, and labor is just going to be like repressed to the point of like effectively losing a lot of its civil liberties. And literally, in the case of the South, Southern black people, and that is exactly what happened.
And this is also reminiscent of today, and perhaps some of the quote-unquote white working class that are Trump supporters. See if this quote resonates with you from Foner. White workers were not conscious of themselves as a working class with its own identity and interests. Rather, they celebrated the promise of social mobility, the opportunity to escape the status of wage labor altogether, while blacks, because of slavery, were acutely aware of the inequalities in American life. White labor saw the society as fundamentally just.
Yeah. Yeah, you I don't know what you call it, false consciousness, or just like bad ideology, bad thinking. But yeah, it's not true, man.
Right. Perhaps that's the through line of so many of these problems, is the inability to see the interconnectedness of those who are exploited by capital, and the need to have solidarity, therefore, and fight for all the different, right? Like insofar as intersectionality is useful, it's useful in seeing that like the different forms of oppression are all related in the uniformity of the the nature of the oppression being exploitation by the capitalist class, and the need for all those different groups to kind of pull together. And it's not just economic exploitation; it's discrimination in manifest way, like manifold ways. But there is a long tradition of dividing and conquering various oppressed groups and pitting them against each other, right?
Yeah, and people come to they come to believe such things, and it may as we were talking about in our previous episode, may come to provide some sort of like sense of status, but it's the price is high, especially if you're a poor person. I think relatedly, so to get back to the history a little bit, what basically broke Reconstruction was the crisis of 1873. So this was a big financial crisis. And I'm not actually sure what it was centered in. Railroads, probably. But anyways, big financial crisis, big depression that followed, and actually wasn't a full recovery for like 20 years until they discovered a bunch of gold in South Africa. And that was a sort of inflationary, stimulus, more or less. But so Republicans had been the huge dominant party because, the Democrats at that time were the party of treason and rebellion, and they lost the war. And for a while, the Republicans like refused to seat their representatives. But when the Depression happened, like the voters did the thing of blaming the incumbent party, and it illustrated the fact that this was an alliance between, on the one hand, like big business in the North, and on the other hand, the bottom of the working class in the South. The most loyal voters in the Republican Party were, Southern black people, for obvious reasons. And yet, when it came time to, the Depression hit 1874, I believe, Congress is trying to pass some sort of an economic stimulus. They had an inflation bill they wanted to pass, which was a kind of like moderate, like coinage. They wanted to print more money, basically, to try to like get the economy going. And Grant vetoed it. And he vetoed it more or less on the influence of big business capitalists in the North. And the result was that it was like the single biggest swing election in the 19th century. Republicans got absolutely crushed. They lost control of the House. And, it basically just sort of cracked open the political economy question of the political economy, like basis rather, of the Republican Party, because you had on the one hand big business capitalists in the North who wanted hard money, austerity, and conservative economic policy, and on the other hand, black people in the South who wanted, it was like working class policy, stimulus. That was like, we weren't particularly arguing for that exactly, but like that was what they wanted. And so it ended up knocking power to the Democrats. And from then on, it was just a matter of time. And in 1876, it was a super close election. It ended up disputed. So the history is quite tangled, but they basically, Republicans ended up agreeing to abandon the South, stop trying to enforce Reconstruction, and they get to keep the presidency in return. And so at that point, black people lost their protection of their suffrage rights, and eventually lost them in every state in the Confederacy.
Yeah,
to varying degrees.
And then by the end of the that depressionary period, you have a huge wave of immigration from Europe coming, right? So just changes the political landscape a bit more from there.
Yeah, and this, I think, is you could totally imagine Democrats ending up in a similar type of bind, and they kind of were in a sense in 2010, because you had this the coalition is minorities, college-educated liberals, but like a significant fraction of neoliberal type of, Silicon Valley capitalists and so forth. And so when the time came to deal with the economic crash, they were hesitant. They were a little worried and ended up not fixing it. And Republicans, they got the swing election in 2010 because unemployment was really high. And so this, I think, the lesson is that you need to do both to achieve social justice. You have to have the political democracy and you have to have the economic democracy at the same time. And in Reconstruction, the fatal flaw was that they never set black people up on a sound economic base, and they didn't have a sound economic policy platform for them either.
And we'll probably discuss this maybe at a different time, but there was an opportunity even after Reconstruction. Alex Gorovich writes about this in the Knights of Labor movement, and the ways in which true freedom was really needing to be tethered to land ownership and the ability to economically be free from wage slavery. And so wage slavery was still a form of slavery that needed to be ended. And that could have been a really revolutionary thing had it succeeded.
Yeah, and you saw after, because the economic pain didn't go away, not even for white people. And so this was like after the end of Reconstruction, you saw the rise of the Populist Party, which was, about kind of ham-fisted or sort of like slightly weird attempts to alleviate the Depression. And it did sort of jumble up the party politics to some degree. Democrats ended up appropriating a lot of that platform. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan ran on free silver platform. I think to this day, that was the most expensive election in American history as a percentage of GDP. It's like the big business Republicans were freaked out. But yeah, at any rate, another in keeping with the souls of black folk, like in sort of like drilling down on the actual reality of the South. Another great thing about Black Reconstruction is the depiction of how redemption, which was the end of Reconstruction, these guys called themselves the Redeemers, to restore white supremacist rule in the South. It was just accomplished with like mass terrorism, like pretty much from about 1866. There's just consistent attempts through violent acts against civilians, and ordinary people just trying to exercise their democratic rights to suppress those people and get them back into a condition of, just subservient, the reestablish a caste system. And in fact, gosh, I get the remember Jonestown? There was like the Congressman Leo Ryan from California who was murdered by the Jonestown cultists. He was the second congressman killed in action who was murdered while, in the line of duty, basically, in the line of being a congressman. The other one, so the first congressman to be killed was James Hinds, or Hines, Hinds. He was a congressman from Arkansas, and he was what they would call a scalawag, or a carpetbagger. Actually, no, he's from New York, and he.
What's the difference between a scalawag and a carpetbagger?
A scalawag is a white Southerner who joined up with the Republicans after the Civil War. Carpetbaggers are white Northerners who went to the South. The yin to the
yang, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so anyways, he was advocating for, black civil rights, Republican Party. And he was campaigning for Grant in 1868. And he was shot and killed by the KKK. That's just the most high profile death. There's hundreds and hundreds of people were killed by white terrorists, most of them Confederate veterans. And as Du Bois goes into, it was like a sort of low level civil war for a lot of the country. And this is one of the things Grant did, was when the KKK first came up, and it was just this gruesome butchery of people. He got really upset, and he sicked the Justice Department on them, and they basically broke up the entire organization. Like they did like the FBI didn't exist at that time, but they did comprehensive investigation and prosecution of people, capturing people, using them to inform on others, and rolling up the whole organization. And they basically broke it apart. But that was just until they lost their political economic base, and after that, Grant didn't have the political support to keep his persecution of white terrorism.
Can we come back to what you were starting to say about the way that justice, or social justice, however you want to think of it, today requires learning the lesson of the Reconstruction era in terms of not separating the goals of political equality and economic equality. I don't even know if equality is the word, but economic justice and political justice, or the need to struggle for those oppressed peoples to not just have the right to vote and not just to be killed by the police state indiscriminately, but not necessarily over and above that, but alongside that, and just as important is the need to have a sustained path to economic freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
and what does that mean exactly, right?
I guess there's sort of two aspects of that I would point out. The lesson of history is that you need a like the fundamental task of a democratic government. If you're in charge of a democratic country, you've got to manage the economy properly, or you're going to get thrown out of office. And so to have like a solid program there, and particularly a way to deal with recessions and financial crises, that is going to require, sound thinking on economic questions. And then at the same time, obviously if people are going to have social justice, that just includes the right to vote sort of by definition, but also, to be able to fight against discrimination and stuff and be able to sort of work against those things, full, civil rights for all people is kind of part of that. But maybe, most importantly in a modern context, you don't have social justice unless you have economic, like a decent economic condition. I think this is a thing, you're already seeing attempts to cast Bernie Sanders as racist because, he focuses a lot on the economic deprivation, and, it's he's certainly been tone deaf on a few occasions, but it is absolutely the case that a huge aspect of racism and, homophobia, transphobia, and so on and so forth, ableism, probably especially ableism, is economic deprivation. You need money to live a good life in this country, or any country. You need access to material resources. And if you leave that out, if you sort of try to do Hillary Clinton, what we need is procedural justice and, return to voting rights and stuff, all that is important, but it leaves out a lot of the picture. And in the case of Clinton and people like her, it leaves it out because she's also trying to court big business, and the same mistake that Grant made when he was president, And so that's the thing you got to watch out for.
Right. And also, political discrimination and cultural discrimination will always piggyback upon exploited classes economically being at a disadvantage to oppose that oppression, right? So it usually goes together. People that are in positions of economic advantage are all the more likely to be able to indiscriminately harm others who don't have the leverage economically to do otherwise. So it's a form of freedom and defense against all forms of discrimination to empower people and decommodify as much as possible the ability of people to feed, shelter, treat their health, these fundamental aspects of human life. If that's not bound up with the wage slavery and the slavery of the tyranny of private authoritarian governments we call corporations, then that is definitely a road to all kinds of emancipatory social justice.
Yeah, and when people have money in their pockets, They can hire a lawyer. They can make bail. They could sue a policeman.
Influence politics.
Yeah, right. They could make a donation. These things matter.
Sociologically, there's a group called the missing class because they're not tracked by the government because they're too economically advantaged to receive welfare benefits. But they're basically like an accident away or a lost job away from falling below the poverty line, and are not wealthy enough to be even middle class, where they have the a kind of coalition that has political voice and is heard. They're working often two jobs or too struggling too hard to just make it economically. They don't really have time to have political agency effectuated. And so this whole group of people that are literally not even counted very often and totally have no voice. So it's large groups of people that, because of their economic situation, have no political voice, even when it's not explicit discrimination.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a case to varying degrees, and across huge swaths of the population.
Any last thoughts on Du Bois?
Very much worth reading. He's an excellent writer, even if the book is a little bit jumbled at times. People have kind of disputed this or that aspect of his interpretation. Like they say that he doesn't really have much about the black church, which I think is a very, that's like a very important institution. But basically that is now the dominant, and I would say inarguably the correct interpretation in broad strokes of the Reconstruction period. He was trying to do the work of like 20 big books at all the same time, and basically got it done. And that was how like smart of a guy he was. That good.
Yeah. So Black Reconstruction in America and Souls of Black Folk, in different ways, brilliant and beautiful and worth your time for what they illuminate, and also how they might inspire action for justice.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Adios.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.